it's like people who can experience that full bandwidth of feeling. And so that's been one of the ways that I've just been trying to wonder is, and again, Jedi mind trick myself, because grief does not come naturally to me, and leaning into the grief journey, but just saying, if I try to bypass this or bright side this, it's actually gonna stall out my ability to experience more joy and patience and love and peace.
Steve, welcome back to the podcast. It's so good to see you. It's been a while since you've been on the show, but we've been texting back and forth, and I just want to say welcome back.
Thank you, Christopher. It's so good to be with you.
Yeah.
I mean, your podcast is one of those ones I frequently listen to just because of
Thank you.
the diverse guests that you have. But you're really, really special at the way
Thank
that you
you.
ask questions and draw people out. And so for me to be on this is truly an honor, bro. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a joy. We're going to really, I think, take a fresh take on grief today. And I'm excited because the last conversation you and I had here was in the middle of a season of transition for you. We talked about really getting under the hood, the issue behind the issue. But today we're going to take a fresh look at grief, I think. I don't want to say this is emblematic of your life, Steve, so I don't want to superimpose anything. But in a way, I just see you as a friend. Like, your life has been profoundly marked by grief in the last 5-6 years, maybe. And you've had an invitation to mourn those losses. So as we dive in, Steve, take us inside the backstory of what led to this fresh take on the grief process and your own experience of it. I mean, a lot has happened even in the last month. You can talk about that if you want. You don't have to either, but just take it from here.
Yeah, well, I think for me, my life has really been driven by achievement. I knew the goal. I knew how to go after it. And in some ways, things worked out. And I found myself in a situation where I was working towards my dream job. And I was going to be the lead teaching pastor at Willow Creek Community Church outside of Chicago, multiple campuses. And allegations came up against my mentor. And I ended up stepping out of my role. And it really was the next day. I drove with my family to Madison. And when I was in Madison, I just woke up the next morning. I was really, really just, what did I just do? I just resigned. What am I going to do? And I just, and I know you've had these moments, but you're crying out to God, I need a word. I need something. And my family's all back at the hotel sleeping. And that's when those 3 words came: grieve, breathe, receive. And I remember okay, all right. I ended up walking to a local donut shop in Madison, and I just wrote, I got to grieve what is, grieve what I thought it was going to be, grieve how key people let me down. I have to breathe in those new mercies, thinking of Lamentations 3. I have to exhale bitterness, and because I feel it already. And I have to receive what I need to learn, receive what I need to own, receive who I can become because of this. I have my journal where I wrote that, and that just became really this mantra for me. And I knew how to achieve. I didn't know how to grieve, man. And that's and I didn't even know what grief really was. I had grievances. I had experiences of loss. I just never took the time to actually slow it down. And so my family and I ended up moving to the desert because I felt like the Lord said, go to the desert and wait for instructions. And we spent 4 years there, and that was a time to get connected to the desert mothers and fathers, the monastic tradition, to really do a ton of deep dive, because the title of your book, I couldn't erase what happened. and I needed to get healing from it. And so the desert offered that. So that's kind of been the journey for us, has just been this invitation to really learn what grief is and how to grieve with hope.
Yeah, I want to talk about grieving with hope later in the conversation, and you've given us so much already that I want to just double down on. The first thing, you'd mentioned bitterness, and I'm curious about this because I'm actually doing this deep dive study right now about acedia, spiritual apathy, bitterness, self-objectification, all these things. And so when you mention bitterness, I just my radar perks up a little bit. What does bitterness feel like in your body, Steve?
It's energy for me. For me, I think bitterness is the result of unforgiveness. Forgiveness is a solo sport, and I think that's what makes my faith journey special, is because I was taught that I can forgive. Now, reconciliation takes more than one person, but forgiveness is a solo sport. That is just me choosing to not let that live in my body. But if I don't participate in the act of forgiveness, that is a seed. And that seed will take root in our heart and in our body and in our shoulders or in our gut. And it will, manifest itself either in anger, gossip, bitterness. And I just realized, oh my goodness, like if I don't deal with this, it's going to overtake me. And I'd have these anger fantasies. Like I would imagine myself in the room with a couple people, and I could just feel it. And it just showed me like, okay, there's a thing beneath a thing here. There's something I need to learn. There's something I need to forgive. And slowly but surely, I got to get that out of my system.
Yeah, like what do you do with that? I walked through something really hard in the last year as well. And when you said you have these moments of, I can see myself in the room with the perpetrator, with the quote-unquote abuser, with the person who wounded you the most. Like, what do you do with that, Steve? And let's just continue to connect this to what bitterness feels like in your body, because if we're going to grieve well, and I want to pull out and make a statement quickly for the folks joined with us, grieving well is not just a decision or an emotional process. Like, it involves spirit, soul, body. Therefore, grief affects our body. It affects our physiology. Bitterness does too. What do you do in those moments, Steve? Like, how do you unravel yourself and decouple your soul from staying in that, I'm in the room and I could do some serious freaking harm to these people who have so wounded me on the core level? Like, as Christians, I don't want to be demeaning, but I just don't think we're great in this space. Like, yes, forgiveness is necessary, but we have to deal with the fact that we've got to address this stuff too in the process of grieving and forgiving. Like, what do you do with that, Steve?
It's so great. Well, I mean, I keep going back to forgiveness, and the two Greek words for forgive is charismai, which is, charis was just grace. So that charismai means the grace you received, you freely give away. And aphemi, which means to release and send away, which takes it back to Yom Kippur, which is like the holiest day for the Jewish people, Day of Atonement. And I started carrying around this little brown cross. And I took those two words, charismai and aphemi, and I just made this short little breath prayer: cross, release, send it away. And anytime I would have that moment where I would envision myself having that conversation, or I would experience a memory of emotional abuse or, abuse that I went through, I put my hand in my pocket and I just would say cross, release, send it away. It's all I could do. And somehow just holding on to the cross, it was so tactile that it got me out of the almost focused, like red hot energy to a posture of like tenderness and, oh yeah. He showcased grace to me. Can I stay open to a miracle? Because if there's, and here's the thing I have to realize, almost had a Jedi mind trick myself into this, is if I don't choose forgiveness, bitterness is going to come. But let's say the other person actually comes to realize what they've done and now want to move towards reconciliation, but I haven't done my work. We won't reconcile. But if I've done my work, because all I can control is what's happening in my heart. And at the soul level, the soul integrates and sin disintegrates the heart, mind, and body. And so the more that I can tap into the cross, releasing, sending it away, the more I'm like more integrated in who I was intended to be. The more I don't, the more I'm allowing sin and the past wounds and trauma and hurts that are real and valid to not just affect me back then, but to continue to hold my life in check.
Yeah, this is interesting. I want to connect this to where we began, because one of the first things you said in our conversation was, I knew the goal. I knew where I wanted to go. Sort of a two-part question. Please tackle it however you'd wish. What happens when grief interrupts the goal? Because that creates an inflection point. But then I suppose this is the deeper question, is moments like those that you walk through, do they become soul attachments whereby if we're not careful and mindful of them, the focus on those soul attachments, like achievement, like promotion, like moving forward in life, whatever, do they circumvent the process of entering into facing the pain so that we can be healed? And thus, it shoves it down further, and later in life, what we don't work out in private will come out publicly and perhaps collapse our ability to lead and live well. Big question, I know.
Well, I think how you just described that is spot on, because the question I ask is, why did I never learn how to grieve? Like, do you remember like when you were a kid and you teared up? For most of us, it was like, as guys, hey, what are you doing? Don't cry. Like, knock that off. Stop being a wuss. Like, so what are you taught at like an elementary age level is, we don't do this. It's weak. So you have that. You also have the sense of, if I can't control my tenderness or sensitivity or how something happens, I can't slow down, because then I'm out of control. So a lot of people are like, I don't know how to grieve because I don't ever want to be out of control. And then the other time, for your first question, is when you have a clear goal, if you stop to grieve, you're like, oh, that's going to slow me down, because I don't know how long it's going to take to process this. Chris, you're going to love this, because I, for the last 20 years, have pretty much done counseling every Monday at 11 a.m. And if you ask me why, it's because I have 6 days to put it back in the box before I had to preach on Sunday. It gave me the most amount of time before I had to get up in front of people. But that was in my subconscious, is why I set that up. Not like because I was so afraid to potentially someday be out of control emotionally on the stage. So I think people have to really wrestle with, what were we taught about grief, and why have we tried to bypass grief? And then I think, for me, that phrase "in Christ" in the New Testament, I started to really dive into that. And Romans 6, the way that Paul writes, it's like, we have died with Christ. So there's like this Good Friday component. We have risen with Christ. There's this Sunday component. And what I found in the reality of grief is oh, Holy Weekend actually gives us a play of how to go through this. And grief was like Good Friday, and Holy Saturday or Silent Saturday is that breathing, like what? Because if you were a first disciple, you didn't think resurrection was a possibility. He was dead. Like you didn't know. But Sunday is the ultimate surprise of like receiving something that we never saw coming. And for me, that grief journey is recognizing we're somewhere on the continuum of Friday being in grief, Saturday thinking we can just get through our grief. But then to your second question, Sunday is we're walking with grief. Jesus returns and he's got holes in his hands. I think that's one of the most beautiful realities is he has the proof of what he went through, and he's like, this will always be with me. This happened. I'm not pretending that it didn't happen. I can't erase the holes to your amazing book. Like I have this, and you will have that loss. You will have that experience. You'll just carry it differently. And that's what God has shown me and done for me, which has been just so, so kind of him.
Let's stay on that metaphor, Steve. What's your take on getting over grief versus going through it? Another way of saying it is like moving on versus moving forward. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there was a great TED Talk, and I remember hearing it, and I just realized, oh my gosh, I have spent so much time just trying to move on. And move on just is like, forget about it. Just like forget it ever happened.
Thank you.
Minimize it, dismiss it. A phrase that my wife and I use often is that I'm really good at bright-siding something. Not experiencing the full spectrum of the emotion, but I will always look for, but there's that. I mean, it wasn't great, but that thing was amazing. That person's awesome. That person was creating the image of God. But I couldn't allow myself to experience the full weight of it. And so what I was just doing was bright-siding. And here's the piece is like, when we do that and we don't work through it on our own, how safe can we actually be as leaders?
What do you mean? You got to nuance. This is incredible what you're saying right now, Steve. How safe can we be if we don't consider, enter in, factor that in? What do you mean by safety? Because, Steve, this is huge.
Well, to hold space.
Okay.
To actually be safe enough to be able to walk with someone who has just experienced grief. The way that I define grief in the book is honoring what comes up when change shows up. So any sense of change that comes, if I can't admit that change happened and feel that and trust that I know how and to actually go through a process to move me forward, I'm just going to bypass it. I'm going to bright side it. I'm going to minimize it, and I'm going to try to move on. But to your point, all we're doing, it's like Jenga. We're just stacking grievances. And we're stacking them, and we're stacking them. And then life does what life does, and it just starts poking a couple of them out. And then the whole thing falls. And that's what we're watching with so many leaders is I look at it and go, oh, in one sense, this profound level of empathy, there were some grievances that you never knew how to actually go through. And what if? What could have been if someone had taught you that and not shamed you because you can't feel soft or you can't feel or you can't. But to your book, like if you are minimizing feeling, you're not maximizing healing. It's not going to happen, And so that for me, just I just think, gosh, for every single one of us, just to begin to recognize, that actually happened, and I wish it hadn't, but now, thanks be to God that Holy Weekend shows us that we can actually grieve, breathe, receive, and find a faith that really is strong enough to hold us even in our darkest hour.
So how do we decouple what happened from this is who I am? I know you talk about that a bit in your new book, and we'll unpack that in greater length here soon, because so many of us, Steve, nurture our wounds to such an extent that we, in a way, like keep them alive, and in so doing, they become part of our identity. No longer was that a thing that happened, so acknowledging, yes, this happened, but it's like, this is inescapably now who I am. How do we decouple, yes, this is what happened, from this is who I am?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think oftentimes when you go through some sense of change, a spouse passes, you lose your job, there's some family estrangement. Oftentimes we've found our identity, and some of it's good. Like, that was my wife. That was my job. That was like I was the lead teaching pastor at Willow. It was a dream job. But without even knowing it, sometimes we can just drift to find our identity in that. And then when grief happens and change happens, well, then all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, I maybe leaned a little over here in my identity, not in Christ, but my identity over here. Well, then the same thing often happens where people go to the other side of the pendulum and they're like, this is just who I am. I will always be this. Or they'll speak of themselves as, the former lead teaching pastor of Willow. Like, my best days are behind me, And I think what we have to, it's why the beauty of going through the process Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it takes time. And I remember years ago, and you probably had these moments where you're like, there's something with what that person's saying. I don't fully understand it, but it just sounds amazing. I was in Jerusalem, and I saw a rabbi, and I just went up and just sat down. I was like, hey, can I ask you a couple of questions? And the rabbi was very kind. He's like, for sure. I said, there are 3 places that represent metaphors in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. Egypt, which was a place of slavery and oppression for 400 years. The desert, which was like wandering, and then the promised land. I said, in your mind, how often or how much time in someone's life do they spend in each one of those 3 places? And the guy just looks at me and goes, you Americans are so funny. You think everything is up and to the right. You think everything is in the promised land. That's not how we see it. 10 to 15% is in Egypt. 10 to 15% is in the promised land. 70 to 80% of your life is learning to live in the desert and trusting that God is with you still. And I was like, I think I've spent my whole life bypassing the desert. I don't want to acknowledge any sense of Egypt or any sense of Friday in my life. I don't want to slow down in the liminal desert or reflect about Saturday. I just want Sunday, and I just want the promised land. And I think that the desert offers us such an invitation to really, talk about that word safe, to experience a God who is safe. And more than that, it's really to trust. And trust for me is a mathematical formula. It's safe plus consistent again and again, over and over on repeat, makes you worthy of trust. Unsafe consistently, again and again, over and over, doesn't make you worthy of trust. And safe inconsistently, again and again, over and over on repeat, doesn't make you worthy of trust. But when you can experience in the deserted place, the forsaken place, the barren place of your dreams, your identity, you're wondering, is there anything on the other side of this? And you can experience that God is safe and He is consistent. He is worthy of trust. You begin to not have your identity be found in the former reality or that change that just derailed so much. You begin to find your identity in the one that you can actually trust.
Steve, it's really interesting. This theme has resonated in so many conversations I've had. Allison Cook and I were talking about the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
Father Ronald Rolheiser was on the pod earlier in the year, and we were talking about the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul conversation continues to come up, and so maybe the question is this: how do we decouple our souls and our expectations from this flimsy gospel of upward mobility, so that, to your point, we learn how to flourish in the desert? In other words, if our nervous systems are in a constant state of dysregulation and we are like, I just got to get through this, because we don't like pain, we're neurobiologically wired to avoid pain, and I got to rush through this, instead of recognizing the God who is safe, and we learn his safety in the desert, like, how do we break our souls off of this? Because there is an injunction and grace afforded to us to learn how to flourish in the dark night seasons, in the desert seasons. We can mix the metaphor any way, but there's a lesson to be learned in this, and I'd love to stay here a bit more with you because you've walked through some stuff lately. I've walked through some stuff. Our friends joined with us inevitably have or are walking through stuff right now, and learning how to flourish in the desert and learning how to receive and recognize his safety in hard seasons is as important as what happens outside of those seasons.
It's so good. I think it's about our relationship with waiting. The Hebrew nation wasn't that far from the promised land, but it took them 40 years. As in one scholar says, it's one thing to leave Egypt, it's another thing to have Egypt leave you. And part of the desert season is you having to really ask yourself some hard questions about your relationship with waiting. And so for many of us, we waste the wait. And I'll tell you, if you waste the wait of the desert, you're going to waste the fruit of the promised land. For some of us, we hate the wait. For some of us, we just hate the wait. Like I can't stand it, so we choose unhealthy escapes, which just makes us go a lot longer to actually step into the land of promise if we ever get there. And I just had this, I wrote down in my journal once, I'm going to either waste the wait, hate the wait, or I'm going to win the wait. And part of that, just for me, was different though than how I typically would have understood the way for me was winning was achievement of goals. Winning was like getting to the promised land. No. Win for me, win the wait, was actually like slow is smooth and smooth is fast. It's, as Micah Boyette calls it, the slower way. It's like me, it's just going slow, trusting that God is with me. Let's look at that kind of vista. There's some unforgiveness. It's turning into bitterness. Oh, wait, that. Let's just go a little slower. Let's just sit with the Lord a little bit more. It was in that I found myself experiencing the surprise of Sunday and the surprise of God's goodness and presence. Not trying to achieve something, not trying to prove something, not trying to hide something, but gently just walking towards a God who could hold my pain and a God who, again, was safe and consistent.
Not necessarily a theological statement, but I wonder, to your point, if there are aspects of the character of the Lord we only experience in certain seasons of life, and I'm not at all ascribing to him the authorship of the pain, the loss, the sickness, all that, but it is to say, I wonder, realizing the reality of his safeness, like we would only gain awareness of that in seasons of being forced to wait. What do you think about that?
I connect with it. I think that, how does someone become resilient? They become resilient when they experience the fires and suffering, But one thought I've been having that's similar to your question that I honestly I'd love to get your take on is if I only ever experience a -3 emotion, it's like -10 on one side, +10 on the other, I probably can only experience a +3 of joy. Like if I like bypass the feeling of suffering, I think it's like changes my ability to experience the fullness of joy. And I think, I've always wondered, why is it when I found myself in different spaces that suffering or oppression has been connected, the worship is different. The joy is different. The lament is different. It's like people who can experience that full bandwidth of feeling. And so that's been one of the ways that I've just been trying to wonder is, and again, Jedi mind trick myself because grief does not come naturally to me and leaning into the grief journey, but just saying, if I try to bypass this or bright side this, it's actually going to stall out my ability to experience more joy and patience and love and peace. And so God, teach me everything I need to know. Like, help me receive what I need to learn. Help me to receive what I need to own. And that's been part of it. I mean, so I met with this trauma therapist and I was explaining everything that happened, my experience. I'll never forget. She looked at me and she said, Steve, I just want you to know, you're a victim in this story. And it was kind of her to say that, but she's like, that's not the most interesting thing for me. And then I was like, oh no, here it comes. She's like, I really just want to ask you, why are you drawn to narcissists? Because if you don't actually wrestle that to the ground, you will find yourself back in the same pattern. And I was like, what? I had never even thought about that, right? And so part of it is, as we look back and experience that, there's a part to go, oh, wow, what was it in me that was so willing to lose my identity in this or that, or choose this or that? And if I don't actually heal from that, I'm probably just going to perpetuate that in some other relationship or in some other context. And that for me just was like, okay, I can learn that. And by learning that and experiencing and believing that God is safe, wow, on the other side of it though is healing. And when there's healing, how can you not lift up a hallelujah? How can you not just celebrate the peace or the joy that you have?
Hebrews talks about a sacrifice of praise. Praise is a sacrifice when it counts, and only on this side of eternity will we have the privilege of offering to Him a sacrifice of praise, because on the other side of eternity, when all pain is erased, it won't be a sacrifice anymore. That's wow. Such an interesting perspective that you just brought, Stephen. I'm thankful for it.
Thanks, man. Thanks. That's an interesting thought. I like that. The sacrifice, yeah.
It won't be a sacrifice in eternity.
Yeah.
And it's the fragrance of our earnest will to say, yet will I praise Him. It is not ignoring the pain of what's happening right now. And that's what I think folks unintentionally miss is like, no, Christianity and our discipleship to Jesus is not adopting amnesia about pain or our past. It's about saying, I will move forward, as we spoke about earlier, with scars, with a promise, with, as you said, an awareness of the reality of a God who is with us. Yeah. Let me drill down on the conversation with your therapist a little bit. She asked you, why are you so drawn to narcissists? How did your relationships change as you moved through the grief process and grieved your losses? Talk to me about the role boundaries played and the dynamics of relationships, and how did all that change? How does it change for us, do you think?
Well, I think when you've experienced betrayal, that kind of trauma is different than the trauma of some sense of death or loss, right? Because the death or loss, like you're having to just wade through the waters of, oh man, like I'll never see that person again. The betrayal messes with you because it plays with discernment. Like you don't know if your discernment got leveled or if you leveled up in discernment. And so what you're really wrestling with is, do I trust myself to actually make a better decision next time? And that was one of those moments in the desert where I just had to like sit with that and say, oh man, yeah, my discernment got leveled. And also I think it leveled up because I think I'm looking for different stuff now. I think I'm asking different questions. This isn't about a dream job now. It's about a place that I'm being called to. Like it's not about, it began to almost like play with the diamond and just kind of turn it and just begin to see different sides, different features, and bring those before the Lord in a different way.
Will you spend a little more time on the trauma of betrayal? In my heart, in my mind, I think I've recognized betrayal is traumatic, but your phraseology, the trauma of betrayal, invokes like fresh questions about it. What do many of us perhaps not understand, realize, step into regarding the traumatic nature of betrayal? And thus there's an invitation for us when we have experienced betrayal now, on the other side of it, to approach healing from it in a different way. I'm not sure I nuanced that question really well.
No, it's great. I mean, I think yeah. I mean, I think that
I'm feeling it right now. Like I'm. This is real time for me. So yeah. I'm asking from a deep place of curiosity because Steve, I thought I was resolved on something, and then it swung open afresh in the last 2 months, and I'm going, where did this come from?
Wow. Yeah. I think betrayal is so tricky, right? Because you sit with someone whose spouse had an affair. You sit with a coworker where the managing partner didn't hold to the agreement and just bounced. You sit to someone who just played with trust in a congregation or played with trust and just betrayed. Like, you're now left having to like figure out, how did this happen to me? How did I get fooled? How did I get tricked? Are you tricking me? Is this person's intentions good? Is this like, how could I not see it? And then often what happens is most people saw it and then they spoke up and they were gaslighted. So then you experience this, I shouldn't feel this way, to use Alison Cook language. Like I shouldn't feel gaslit, like, and what's wrong with me? And so now you're like shaming yourself again because I shouldn't feel this way. And yet the reality is someone gaslit you and basically told you, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. And then you actually took it to say, I'm wrong. I'm wrong. I'm wrong. And then you find out what they did was wrong. And then you're like, I don't know what to do with all of it. And you're left holding the bag. And again, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. But that betrayal piece is just so much in the subconscious that it takes time, it takes mentors, great therapists, spiritual directors, friends, pastors, people to actually recognize, oh, that wasn't you. That was because you were gaslit. That wasn't you. That was because you were wrong. That was you. You're attracted to narcissists, Steve. Like what like that. What? And I think just to be able to look at it in a place of patience and grace and safety.
That's really good. Okay, I want to connect actually betrayal to the breathe part of this equation. Grieve, breathe, receive. Unpack how, and perhaps connect it to betrayal and the trauma of betrayal. How do we make sense of the readjustment, disorientation, and confusion so present during the grief process? And again, let's just stay here using the example of betrayal. Readjustment, disorientation, and confusion, because all those experiences are so stinking real and, in this breathe phase. Like, what's that look like?
Well, I think that's where the gift of Silent Saturday, Holy Saturday, it's, those disciples had no idea that resurrection was coming. Like, they'd given up 3 years of their life to follow someone, and they all had their own expectations. And I think it's in that just to breathe in and breathe out, and just what's happening inside my body, what's happening inside my mind, what's happening inside my heart. Because again, the soul wants to integrate the heart, mind, and body. And the more that you can really sit with that truth, and I just had to walk and stop and just, Andy Colbert taught me a ton, but just in the sense of breathing in these short little breath prayers and exhaling out. And it just slowed myself down. And I didn't want that bitterness living inside me. I didn't want that anger rushing through my body. I wanted, and then the other side of it too is you actually think you can get through it if you just do the right stuff. And for some people, there's a band brand new, and they have this song. It's called Jesus Christ, and there's a line in it. It says, "Jesus Christ, what did you do those 3 days that you were dead? Because this problem is going to last more than the weekend." And I absolutely love that, because when I think about what happened in 3 days, but we don't get over our grief in 3 days. Hebrew Nation, it took 40 years. For some of us, it just takes, and we don't know, but yet we trick ourselves to believe, oh, I can get through this really, really quickly. When in actuality, it's going to take time, and you can't speed it up. You can't rush it. And that took a long time for me to learn, if I'm really honest, man. I didn't know how to do that.
This might be a horrible question, because I don't want it to sound insensitive to anyone, but I think there are markers in our soul, and it's going to be different for everybody. How do we know we're healing? I keep going back to this example of betrayal. How do we know, that we're healing and not living from an open wound? I'll say this from personal experience, and I'm so cool with being vulnerable. As I told you, I experienced a profound level of betrayal last year. I would wake up in the month, 2 months, 3 months that followed, in the middle of the night with a racing heartbeat, and I've never felt these emotions before. And then working through it, inner healing therapy, the whole thing, okay, I can acknowledge it, make a space, I'm going to move forward, making these choices. And then, Steve, it flared up again. And I thought, am I not as healed as I thought I was? What's your take on, oh gosh, I don't want to make this sound like a life hack, but yeah, how do we know we're healing?
Yeah. Well, I think whenever you feel that level of emotion, it just showcases how much that person meant to you. You know what I mean? The betrayal was so real. That person meant something to you. That job meant something to you, or for me, that meant something. And so, of course, it's going to come back. of course there's going to be moments that you're going to be reminded of it because, but I think it's how you see it. I'm very fascinated, and my therapist has been really helpful in this for me because I really believe in something called IFS, like internal family systems. And really like what it does is recognizing that there are parts to your story. There's parts to who you are, but sometimes we speak from our parts like that it almost like that moment hijacks us and takes over. And we're not making a decision as, Steve Carter at 44 years old who's grounded and beloved in Christ. Like, I'm making a decision when I was 38 or when I was 12 from this point. And there's a difference from speaking from my part and speaking for my part. Because I can look and I can say, yeah, that really hurt. That really hurt. I really thought it would be different, and it wasn't. And yeah, that hurt. Let's just acknowledge it, And if you think about like when you were a kid and you skinned your knee on a bike, like, there's a moment where you would clean it out with peroxide and put a Band-Aid on it, but you had to take the Band-Aid off and clean it up again, and then you'd put a new Band-Aid on it. And I think you couldn't just keep pouring peroxide on it. It would never heal. But I think just there's moments that you have to tend to it, and you have to tend to some of those parts. And there are moments for me that I have to go back to, a handful of really traumatic moments in my life and just almost sit with that and just say, hey, I see you. Like, I see you. And hey, that experience actually helped me become who I am today. And I wish it didn't happen, and I don't want it to happen for my kids. But yeah, thanks for not giving up on me. Like, thanks for I almost have a tenderness like it is my son or my daughter, just this part. And so and again, that's why my definition for grief is like honoring, because I wasn't always good at honoring what comes up when change shows up. And I think honoring it is honoring like, yeah, that happened, but honoring that it mattered, honoring that relationship mattered, or that job mattered, or honoring that you didn't see this coming, or honor that all of those feelings, and just to be able to sit with it with just such kindness and grace, and asking the Spirit to just show you what's the next best right step.
That's so good. I think one of the things I'm thinking about, Steve, is, again, how grief, how trauma, and the process therein affects body, mind, spirit. So you're in the place as a leader, as a high performer, so to speak. You have goals. You're an effective communicator. You're an effective leader. I'm curious about this because I think this could resonate with folks today. Is like, when grief hits you and affects you, body, mind, spirit, how does grief, and how did grief affect your mind, your cognition, your thinking processes, your creativity, your strategy? Like, I've not asked really anyone that particular question, and I ask it from a personal standpoint because in my own grieving lately, I've felt I'm not as sharp as I have been. I'm not innovative like I used to be, and it scared me a little bit. Just curious about your take on that, your experience.
That is interesting. I mean, I think one sense for me is there's a difference between a first half of life energy and second half of life energy.
Oh, you read Arthur? Do you read Arthur Brooks?
Arthur Brooks,
From
yes,
Strength to Strength?
for sure. Yes.
Yeah. Come on. Yeah.
So I think that's a huge piece. But here's the interesting thing for me is, I've been in like some meetings recently, and I reminisce about some other experiences of meetings that I was in that were with high performing leaders, and the energy that you would get being in that room, the pressure to come up with the next idea, it's been interesting. Like, I've actually missed it. And I think somewhat, that I haven't known what to do with that, because it's not all bad. It's like I remember it, and I think instead of having the strategy though drive me, I want the formation and the healing to drive me. And that's, and I always will tell my team, like, I just will say, if I have a healthy framework, it makes my life work. If I don't know the answer to a question, I just look for a higher value. And if I can find that higher value, that can almost be my true north. And there's moments that I'm like, oh, I missed that. But I think what I missed was like getting somewhere, but not necessarily, formation wasn't at the focal point. You know what I mean? And so just to be able to look at it objectively too.
I don't think it would be fair to end this conversation by saying, hey, we're going to just put a bow on this, because maybe that's the point of the grief process. Kessler and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said together basically that we never get over our grief, but we will change through it. And I think this is sort of just another leg of the journey. So again, folks, you're joined with us and you've experienced tremendous loss. You are experiencing loss right now, and you're saying, when does this hemorrhaging of my soul end? I don't know. But what I do know is we can take steps to move forward, to receive, to slow down, as we said, to flourish in the desert. Many people, Steve, right now are in transition in life, and that has become so cliche, but I like the idea of the liminal space, the Emmaus Road that we all walk on. Let's just land here today for folks. What's your hot take on navigating liminal spaces and transition with character excellence and integrity?
It's good.
Maybe it's not a hot take. Maybe it's seasoned wisdom, actually. I should have phrased it that way, because you've walked through it, Steve.
Yeah. I think that what I realized is I didn't know how to grieve, and my understanding of hope was very whimsy. Meaning, I talked about hope like, I hope the University of Michigan football team wins the national championship. Like, I hope that there's no traffic on my way to the airport. But what I was really speaking about was uncertainty. And I think that's how so many of us think about hope. It's like, it's uncertain if it's ever going to get better. It's uncertain, which only prevents us from actually experiencing the full surprise that God wants to offer us. It might look different than what we want it to be or expect it to be, but we might miss it. And so what I came to realize was hope in the Roman tradition, it was actually frowned upon. All you had was kind of the ability to have reason and reality, like this happened. That's all you have. Don't have some hope for a better day. Like, stay focused on the empire. And when Paul in Romans 5 talks about the perseverance and the character is going to have this hope manifest, and hope will never be put to shame, that was a totally entirely new take. And so when you get to then 1 Thessalonians, and it's like, hey, we grieve with hope, I started to just sit there and I just was like, okay, well, what is biblical hope? And that's where you desire something good. You start with, what do you desire? Get really clear about what you desire. And then, as Joby Martin says, if the tomb is empty, anything is possible. So my desires, anything is possible. And why? Because resurrection brings certainty. It's not uncertain. What does Andy Stanley say? Like, if a man walks this earth and predicts that he's going to die and rise 3 days later and pulls it off, you should just go with whatever that guy says, And I think resurrection for me, what's more difficult, bringing a man back from the dead or healing my soul? I think more difficult to bring a man back from the dead, and I think my soul can be healed. So if I desire something good, I believe anything's possible because resurrection brings certainty, then I can expect that good is on its way. And I don't know when it's going to come, and I can't control when it's going to come, but I can do the work that puts me in a position that moves me from in grief to believing I can get through grief to actually be surprised to receive what God has so that I can walk with grief, but just differently from here on out.
There's the period on the sentence, Steve. I'm so thankful for you, my friend. Thank you for being here today. Anything else today that you'd like to share? Obviously, you've got the new book out. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But what I appreciate about you, Steve, is that this wasn't a kitschy idea. You're living this. You're walking it out. This is part of your own discipleship and formation journey. And there's a curiosity that I love about your writing. There's a curiosity and hey guys, let's consider this, and I think it's worth paying attention to. So I'm so thankful for you.
Well, thank you, man. I do think it's really remarkable. I mean, your book came out, 5 weeks before mine and 6 weeks, and I look at it and I go, there is something around this conversation of healing and formation and grief, and I love how you just really attacked it in such a beautiful way, and it's just fun to watch, like my friends who people like you who are just doing the harder, more beautiful work. But like you admitted, like it doesn't mean that you don't have flare-ups and flashbacks, but what you do have is the commitment to not just hope it's going to be erased someday, but actually taking steps towards it. And any of you listening, just and I hope that you will experience a God who is safe and consistent, and who's worthy of trust even in the midst of whatever you're walking through, and that would allow you to honor it as you grieve, breathe, receive. So, Chris, thanks for having me, man. I'm a big fan of you, and thanks for the way that your book ministered to me. And yeah, man, you're the real deal.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you, my friend. Hey, tell folks where to track with you online. You've got a killer podcast, and I'd love for people to stay connected to all things Steve Carter.
SteveCarter.org is where you can find me, or on Instagram. It's X or whatever they call it these days, at Steve Ryan Carter. And then I have a podcast, Crafting Character, which we talk about the craft of communicating while always hoping our character leads the way. So
good. Steve, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, my friend.